very warm afternoon to you. It's a delight to have you join us here on 60 Minutes Nigeria. I am Uyi Agmofwegwe. We're live in Benin City, Nigeria. It's important to take a look at one segment, very critical segment of society that we seem to have maybe neglected largely in our conversation about our great country, Nigeria. We get to talk about politicians, we talk about the armed forces, we talk about the fight against corruption. Sometimes the extent to which you're able to integrate this particular segment of society that does a whole lot of work on behalf of members of the public becomes an entirely different conversation in itself. The civil society, or what some persons will call the organized civil society, or the civil society organizations. Very important. How much do we talk about them? How much do we understand the kind of work that they do, the extent to which they have to risk it all where necessary to ensure that it becomes a better country, a better geographical space for all of us to live in. The civil society people basically lend their voices, invest their resources in issues of governance, issues of public health, issues of justice, fairness, and equity. We've seen, for example, where the civil society would even have to step up for people who can afford legal fees, for instance, will have to lend their voices to the plight of widows and those who are overall vulnerable in society. They speak truth to power where situation also calls for it. We've seen some who have had to pay the ultimate price just by having to advance that conviction that society can always be a better place. We want to have that conversation today, especially again in light of the fact that we have two instances of standalone election that are right in front of us. One, the Edo-Goba race, and then, of course, the one of Ondo State. My guest on the program today is someone who has seen the inside of what it means to be a member of the civil society organizations. I'm very delighted to be joined by Christopher Ojekere. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Good afternoon, viewers.
For the records, Chris is Programs Manager for Foundation for Good Governance and Social Change. He'll be sharing part of his experiences with us on the show in the next 21 minutes. Let's quickly take a look at civil society in Nigeria today.
Yes.
We know, for example, in the days of the military, how much many of your colleagues had to risk just to ensure that certain critical issues were not swept under the carpet. I already made an allusion to that at the top of the program to say some had to pay the ultimate price for it. As it stands today, it's as if we're a bit laid back. It's as if we've already hit El Dorado, have we?
Well, the civil society is an unsung group. It's an unsung segment of the society. Even though analysts have come up to say the civil society is the third sector in society, but to majority of the people, especially in developing countries, where many things are far from civil, the civil society is unsung and most of their work unrecognized because they are not competing for media hype and media space. Much of their work is done with the very grassroots of society, with communities, with rural communities, with the underprivileged, with the deprived. They are not mostly sung. But the civil society in Nigeria has come a very long way. Well before the military, in fact, before independence, when you had groups like the Omo Egbe Oduduwa, and then the Jamia Mutanin Arewa, though later graduating to become political parties, but they started off as civil society groups. They were groups that saw the need of the so-called Nigerian state at that time before it was named, after it was named, and they realized that the Nigerian state needed to have self-independence and they have to have self-rulership. So they began to mobilize towards that and joined up with the nationalists, the foremost nationalists at that time, and then their voices coupled with that of the nationalists pushed for independence, and we got independence. After independence, they started to push for good governance. Because between independence and 1966, where you had the first coup, the nationalists and these people who are at the forefront of the civil society groups were a bit disappointed at the kind of governance that we're having, the kind of corruption, the kind of ineptitude in government and all of that. So they decided to push for good governance. Part of their push and part of the awareness they created led the military young boys, to carry out the first military junta. Now fast forward to this Civil War. After the Civil War, it was the civil society group that were pushing for the 3 arrows which Gowon had promised: reconciliation, rehabilitation, and then reconstruction. It was civil society group that ensured that those 3 arrows were, implemented. So the civil society in Nigeria had always mutated according to the needs that was available at the time. And beyond the civil war, we had the military interregnum, which was bad governance. You will think that with all the muzzling of freedom of speech and the muzzling of freedom of expression of the military tactics of dictatorship, that the civil society will be muzzled, but not so. The civil society during the military regime, especially in the last years of the military regime between 1993 and 1999, were responsible for the return to democracy. I mean, you could name groups like the National Democratic Coalition, NADECO. You could name the Civil Liberties Organization. You could name the Campaign for Democracy. You could name the Center for Democracy and Development. You could name other groups that formed coalition and came up to say Nigeria must return back to civil rule, must return back to democracy. And they put the military under so much pressure that you started to see a lot of jittery among the military hierarchy. And we have started to hear languages from people like Babangida that he was stepping aside, which meant nothing to anybody as at that time, because we didn't know whether stepping aside meant he was quitting the scene or he was actually going to return. So it was the civil society that put the military, especially NADECO, all kudos to them, that put the military under that kind of pressure, and then we returned back to democracy in 1999. After 1999, the civil society thought it was incumbent on them to preserve that democracy. They didn't go back to sleep. There were a lot of things that have happened since 1999 that have helped to further our democracy, that have helped to, make our democracy more robust, that have helped to contribute to the development of our democracy. I could name, a few instances if I could go, if I could just go on. Now, after 1999, when it was looking like democracy was going to be captured again, because the person that was brought in 1999 came straight from the military, and that was the president, Olusegun Obasanjo, and he didn't seem to have been weaned from his military dictatorial tendencies and thinking. So after he had done the constitutionally required 2 terms, Obasanjo wanted to have a 3rd term. It was the civil society group that defeated the 3rd term. In fact, I remember at that time, Bamidele Aturu, a prominent civil society activist, formed a coalition of civil society that we called Coalition of Civil Society Against 3rd Term. And then they went all out against it, especially after the tentacles of the civil society became alerted when Jerry Garner had brought to the National Political Reform Conference, National Political Reform Conference that Obasanjo had put up, as I say, to get people who could oppose the 3rd term to be busy discussing. And while they were discussing, Jerry Garner smuggled in a paper and circulated. Obasanjo's, according to Tony Aneni later, had described Obasanjo's 3rd term language as body language. And then all other activities showed to the civil society that Obasanjo was heading towards 3rd term. It was anti-constitutional. According to Bamidele, the conference that was called by Center LSD, the Center for Legislative Studies in Ikeja, I remember, after that conference, what they came up with was that the 3rd term agenda was divisive, it was an ill wind that would do no one any good, and it was diversionary, and it was illegal, it was unconstitutional. Now, the civil society were the ones who led and ensured that there was pressure mounted on the president to defeat the so-called 3rd term agenda. Now, if the 3rd term agenda was not defeated, you could just begin to imagine what the narrative of our democracy would be. Now, in May 16th, I think, on a Wednesday, 2006, that agenda was defeated. The Senate was so much under pressure to throw away the so-called reform bill that had been sent in by the executive, that about 116 reforms, constitutional reform bill, were thrown away because third term had become a sour point that has soured that bill, and everything was thrown away. Although people later said that they could have selected those things within the bill that would have been able to advance.
So instead they had to, as you say, throw the baby and the bathwater
away because third term was so odious, it was so counterproductive and anti-democratic that the only way they were sure that third term was going to be annihilated was to throw the entire thing away, and third term was thrown away. Now, civil society didn't stop there. When the President Goodluck Jonathan, had problems with the so-called cabal, in quotes, that time, to be sworn in
as acting president
after Yar'Adua had gone, on away without leave, so to speak. And then there was no letter transmitted to his deputy, which was Jonathan, to his right, which was Jonathan, to take over the reins of governance. And it looked like the country was, there
was a vacuum.
Yeah, there was a vacuum. The civil society rose up to the occasion. And organizations and groups like Save Nigerian Group and the Enough is Enough Group organized a march, moved on to the National Assembly, and ensured that the Senate and the National Assembly in cohesion came up with what we call the doctrine of necessity.
Right.
And with that doctrine of necessity, Goodluck Jonathan was made substantive president. That was another milestone of the civil society. But perhaps one of the greatest milestones was the Freedom of Information bill that became an act. You must know that the Freedom of Information bill first got to the House in the very first dispensation of the first, return to democracy
in
1999, which Nigeria calls the Fourth Assembly.
Yes.
Now it got to the Fourth Assembly, it made no headway. It was brought into the Fifth Assembly. Obasanjo vetoed it, but the civil society did not rest. That time they were being led by Media Rights Acts, Media Rights Organization,
right.
and then I think the Right to Know organization. These were the two civil societies that led the coalition of civil society to ensure that bill returned to the Sixth Assembly. And in the Sixth Assembly, under Yar'Adua, happily, that bill was passed. The Freedom of Information Act, which itself is an instrument for democratic reform.
How much has the civil society leveraged that instrument as we speak today?
Well, the civil society has its own beats and its own mandate within society.
Of course.
They are to ensure that they put pressure on policymakers and decision makers to change policies, to change laws, to change practices, to change conventions that are anti-people, that are against democracy, the rule of law, and social justice. Now, having done that, and having ensured that in that advocacy, for instance, they were able to get to the Nigerian public that we expect other organs and sectors of society, for instance, like your sector, the media sector,
right,
to take advantage of Freedom of Information Bill and ensure that publications are made of the ministries and departments of agencies of how Nigerian money is being spent, so as to ensure accountability, transparency within governance spending. In fact, that bill says that every government spending organization, institution, whether it's department, whether it's ministry or agency, should have a transparent and accountable, system that Nigerians would have access to, especially the media, so as to publish it, and Nigeria would know the goings on within such ministry, the expenditure of the budget, whether it is targeted at projects that are beneficiary to the public. So the civil society's bit and mandate is to ensure that those systems are in place so that other sectors of society will take advantage of those systems and ensure that they are, they're implemented.
I won't pretend like I don't know what you have done here.
Yeah.
You have been able to establish a very fine trajectory.
Thank you.
With a summarized historical perspective to the conversation.
Yes.
But then again, there are people who would rather argue and tell you the civil society as we know it in Nigeria today has become weakened over time, and they will enumerate a number of factors: compromise, fifth columnist. They will talk about those who only use the civil society as a vehicle to attain selfish and personal agenda. For example, we've heard about people who posed as civil society, as members of civil society, as activists at the time, only to later realize that the whole idea, the whole time, had been to vie for an elective office, which in itself is not wrong. But the idea of the end justifies the means. Isn't that also a concern within the civil society circles?
All right. I think there are two sides to your question. Now, the first side has to do with a fact of life,
right?
Appearance and reality. There are those, you see, society has not prescribed people from taking nomenclatures.
Yeah.
So there are those who can assume certain positions and then begin to answer those names. That is why you find some roadside mechanics calling themselves engineers, and you find some roadside tailors calling themselves fashion designers and all of that. So you have appearance, you have reality. Now, the ideal called civil society practitioners, people who know their onions, who have taken time to build up their capacity, who are conscious of integrity, and who are able to understand the issues and have been able to delve into it and engage government and policymakers in it, are there. They may not be seen and sung, but they are doing their work, and they are the ones that are responsible for some of these things that I have told you, and they are responsible even for more. For instance, you understand that we had the so-called 700 Naira fixed charges. It was my boss, Austin Osakwe of the FGGSC, and we are very proud to say that, who took up that campaign and drove it up to national level, even the National Assembly, to ensure that, the 700 Naira fixed charge is removed. And today, that is a success story. But there are those who you say, who could be parading the streets in the name of civil society. They are more visible because they are on the street, they are loud. Empty vessels all usually will make the louder noise. You know, that's a fact of life. So they are on the street, they are parading, and then there are issues of compromises. There are issues of, of using that vehicle and that name to do unwholesome practices. That we cannot deny. Just as you have in the media, you have journalists of repute like you and many others. You also have the people they call the brown envelope journalists. So these are realities. Now, but that shouldn't detract from the fact that the core civil society practitioners who understand what it's all about are doing their work on a daily basis. Now, what people should learn to know is to understand what is the mandate of civil society, so that you'll be able to understand those you call civil society and those that are street workers who are using that name. But again, even for core practitioners of civil society, we cannot run away from the fact that there are challenges. There are challenges with institutional responses to civil society work. How does government view genuine civil society practitioners? Do they see them as co-workers in the vineyard of building democracy, so to speak? Or they see them as opposers to government policies? Now, these are challenges. There are challenges of funding. Some civil society groups are not able to do as much as they would like to do because there are challenges of funding, even from international donors. There are challenges. There are international donors that want you to toe certain, idiosyncrasies, that they have with respect to what they think you should be doing within your society, and you might not want that. Are you following me? And so there are these challenges. They are there. So there are challenges of government cooperation with the civil society. How well are ministries, departments, and agencies, for instance, willing to allow you access to information, even when there's a freedom of information bill? How well would policy makers in the House of Assemblies and in the executive allow you to sit down with them and engage them on certain policies and certain ideas? They might be thinking of the next election. You are thinking of development. You are thinking of what will be of benefit to the people. So these challenges are there. Now, these challenges may look a bit hamstrung for civil society to be able to do their job seamlessly in developing countries, especially in countries like Nigeria. I used to tell people I know, especially my wife, that it's a very tall order to practice civil society in a society that is not civil. Because you have to have a level of understanding and cooperation with your civil engagement for you to be able to do a seamless work. That might not be present here. So these are challenges, no doubt. But that is a far cry and very different for those who just answer the name, do not understand the issues, do not understand the scope, and do not understand the mandate, and then they begin to walk the streets and are using the organization to blackmail and arm twist people in local areas, to collect money from them and all of that. That usually is what people see. And those who do not understand the nitty-gritties of it will say, oh, civil societies are just that. Those are not really civil societies.
We've seen several situations in this country where, even in our state here, where civil society practitioners have had to split.
Yes.
Some have had to take up new names, register new names, establish new fronts.
Yes.
What are the reasons we can adduce to this? Because some persons will say it's the fight over money. Some say it's the fight over grants. But we understand that basically it's almost impossible for civil societies to access grants. What exactly is the situation?
Well, it's not impossible for them to access grants. I mean, there are hundreds and thousands of grants over there. What you have mostly is the inability for people to build capacity to be able to put up convincing proposals and articulate convincing ideas and work plan to convince donor agencies and those who give grants to give grants. Now, splits and disagreements could come because civil society is populated by people. People have their differences. It could be ideological. People have their differences. It could be selfish, as I said, and as we said earlier. People could come into it not understanding the parameters and nitty-gritty of civil society, and they say we want to be civil society practitioners. And then I'll give you a very interesting example. My boss says it, and he even said it yesterday, where you find young ones who say they want to be civil society practitioners. They will come to the office and they want to get knowledge, training, and education on how to go about it. And then when he starts talking about the time it takes, the capacity you have to build, and all of that, and they say, no, it's not that we came for. What we really, can't you just tell us how we just, want to hit the ground running? You know what they are talking about? They are talking about how are we going to be as successful as you are within this short period?
And that doesn't happen overnight.
Yes, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a process.
Right.
Civil society, achievements and civil society successes has to be a process. You have to activate the process and follow it through. And in following it through, you have to be building capacity. You have to have the information. You have to know what are the issues. If you are going to engage government, that is the business of government. And so in that tough, government is our authorities. If you are going to have to engage them, you have to know not just what government knows, but what government doesn't know. And all of this takes time to build your capacity. You have to understand the issues of management and development. You have to understand the issues of universal acceptability with respect to rights issues, with respect to policy issues, with respect to gender equalities and all of that. Now, people are not willing to sit down to undertake this kind of trainings. They are not willing to sit down to build this kind of capacity, and so they think there's a shortcut and they want to go on their own, maybe start a name and then begin to protest and look for those who will give them little money to run programs. That's not the whole idea of civil society.
There's something I have to ask you quickly, and hopefully we can dedicate 1 minute to each of them. The issue of the abachalut.
Yes.
We're seeing civil society practitioners, some of them frontliners, who have come to say they want to be part of the monitoring process of how the recovered loot will be spent based on the already agreed templates.
Yes.
How successful have we been with that?
Well, that's not been very successful, and it's not civil society's fault.
Okay.
It is the fault of the fact that we run a democracy in a unitary style. We run a democracy in a dictatorial style. I mean, the president just wakes up one day, writes up some communique, comes, sits down, and it is called a meeting, and he reads to them what they have decided without discussing it. So we run that kind of style. Now, civil society are saying, make the system more transparent. We want to be part. They are not saying, give us the money. We just want to understand the trajectory of your operations. Want to be part of the system, want to know what programs and policies you have put in place, want to know what feedback mechanisms you have put in place, what checks and balances you have put in place in expending this money. It's Nigerians' money.
Right.
Yeah, so now we've not been very successful. Today, we don't even have the true figures of how much have been recovered so far. Today, the president says we are putting it on Shopee and we're going to use it to take care of the very poorest of the poor. Okay, give us the Shopee program. Let us understand how much was got, Who are the people, who are the recipients, who are the shopping recipients? Where are they located? How do you define the indigents? Where are they located? The civil society just wants this information so that we can put track, because it's public expenditure, it's public money. There should be transparency and accountability.
So it should be more all-inclusive.
Yes, it should be more inclusive.
The discourse should be opened.
In fact, civil society's one of its core objectives is to have what you call participatory governance, where citizens participate in governance.
Okay.
Citizens are carried along.
You see, that issue of participation is one core element we can't take away from this discussion.
Yes.
And that brings us to the issue of election. In Edo State, for example, the gubernatorial election 2020 is upon us. In 30 seconds, give me bullet points of what the civil society is likely to do differently as far as the Edo governorship election scheduled for 19th of September is concerned.
Well, the civil society has a domestic election monitoring group.
Okay.
Now, you can be sure we'll monitor the elections. Now, you can also be sure that the most credible reports that will be written in that election will be written by the civil society group.
Because it's
non-partisan, and it's non-profit. Now, you can be sure that civil society would ensure that prior to the election, there will be voters' education. There will be enlightenment, voters' awareness created, so that people will be aware of their rights and aware of the franchise that they have to wield, so that they will not be corrupted by money sharing and all of that. So the civil society is going to play their role. We're going to monitor the elections from booth to booth, booth to polling booth, from ward to ward, and then give the world a report. That will be done by civil society. Okay,
that's a very beautiful point where we're going to anchor. Thank you so much, Christopher Ojekere.
Thank you.
For coming on the program to share with us along this line. That's our program for you on 60 Minutes Nigeria. This week I'm Agbo Mofwegbe. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday.